Anyway, so I'm here to talk to you about decentralization and the future of personal data. So I started a company called Textile.io. We're building a product called Textile.photos. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the talk. But really, I want to talk to you more generally about personal data and how it affects directly this community of people working on geospatial data sciences and mapping and cartography. First of all, thank you, CARTO, for having me. I'm really proud to be here, see all my old friends, and talk to you about something that I think is really important. So to understand how we think about personal data and technology, I think it's really interesting to frame it as how it fits into the technology that we're all building. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about centralized technology, centralized versus decentralized technology, and how centralized technology has really the sort of phenomena of centralization in technology has shaped our understanding of our own data and why that's really important. This first part that I'm going to talk to you about, I pulled from a blog post by an investor named Chris Dixon. And he put this graph together, which I think is really interesting, which I'm going to come back to, which is making the point about how centralized technologies have utilized the growth of user bases to build value in those organizations, and then they have to find new sources of value, and they turn to actually extracting value from their users. And so I'm going to come back to that point. But the first place we need to start is where the technology that we're all using, the technology of the internet, has its beginnings, which is in a decentralized system. So when the internet started first forming, it was really a bunch of decentralized nodes, no governing body, no centralized authorities. So if you wanted to take part in any sort of internet communication, you would just throw a node into the network and start communicating with other people there. Some really interesting things were developed during this period. Some of the most important ones were the protocols, right? So the SSH, the TCP/IP, the SMTP. So and we still rely on a lot of those protocols today. It's how we connect to the internet. It's how you send messages. It's how you send an email. It's how you know that the person that you're sending the email to is going to receive it. It's how servers talk together. Very important. Those protocols are primarily controlled by communities. Again, non-centralized, non-governed communities of aggregated people with limited authority. The challenge at this time in the internet, right, was the barrier to entry, right? So if you did want to throw a node onto the internet, it was actually very challenging. You had to go and learn a lot about these protocols. You had to learn how to connect. You had to get close to some mechanism for sending your information through the backbone of the internet. But also during this period, if you think about it, there were very few forms of data at all being collected, let alone personal data. Actually, almost no forms of personal data. Things like your IP address, but very few people would actually be collecting that for anything. There was not enough of it to mean much, and the emails you wrote. And of course, so if there wasn't much data, there was nothing like a marketplace for data. There weren't people trying to sell data. There weren't people trying to sell knowledge from the data that they were collecting. So this was sort of like a data barren period. But we didn't stay there. We didn't continue developing in a decentralized world. Momentum started moving towards centralized technologies. And so built into the decentralized system, we saw centralized organizations emerge. And so you can think of the big ones, and they're all sort of there. So the Googles, Apples, Facebooks, and almost everything else you can think of. And they emerged from the value of these decentralized protocols that were built. But what they did is they made that barrier to entry go down. So if you think about it, prior to the centralized technologies, having an email account was very challenging because you had to have an email server. So maybe you were part of a university that would run an email server for you. Outside of that, you had to be fairly technologically savvy to take part in even sending an email. An organization like Google comes along and offers you email, that barrier to entry goes down because suddenly they take care of all that hard stuff for you. You go and grab an account and you sign in online. That's been really, really great for the internet, obviously, because lowering the barrier to entry has brought in all the billions of people that are now part of it. But it's changed the world, right? So if you look at the value of companies and how they've changed in that same period that this centralization has been happening, we can see that the top 10 companies by market cap have suddenly had these new companies emerge that were not even close to that 10 years ago, right, with Apple and Alphabet and Google at the very top. The way that they've had this amazing growth can be largely attributed to network effects. And the reason I'm bringing up network effects is because network effects actually have two really interesting and important forms for why these companies became so large and valuable. The first, if you're not familiar with network effects, the first network effect that's important to think about is the sort of vanilla network effect, right? So it basically says, Facebook for the first user was a very lonely place, right? But every new person that joins Facebook, it suddenly becomes more valuable. And that value is exponential. So every new person adds more value to the network than themselves alone. And Silicon Valley companies really started to understand this concept almost intuitively in how they wanted to aggregate users to their systems in order to create value in those systems, in order to create value that they could show investors to raise capital and continue to grow. And that has actually promoted the growth of centralized organizations. It's promoted these organizations that have so many users. There's a second network effect that is less understood, but potentially more important today, and that's data network effects. And so we're seeing this concept emerge in organizations like Facebook, where the value of having data about a user is not very valuable. But if you can have data about many, many, many users, you can start doing things like create more advanced algorithms, train more advanced models, get better insights, deeper insights. And that's leading to the same kind of exponential value growth in these organizations. I like to think about it that data has gravity. Because once these organizations realize the value of the data that they're aggregating, they realize that the more of that data that they can pull in, the more value that they can create for themselves. And then they can use that to grow in the market. So this slide was pulled from a report that the organization that put the report together spent a lot of time digging into all the different aspects of Facebook. They put out maybe a handful of different reports about different characteristics of the Facebook technology and network. And this one was from 2016. And in 2016, this is just some overview of the different types of data that Facebook had access to. So 1.4 billion monthly active users. Really important for this group, right, is 17 billion location tagged posts. Right, so they had 17 billion posts that were describing a location in space, and they're not even a geospatial company. Okay, so that gives Facebook this ability to put together, their groups focus on AI research, and it allows them to sell advanced ad targeting, and it allows them to do a lot of things. And so once they have access to this kind of data, this data has gravity. They want more and better kinds of data, and so when you go to Facebook and you use the homepage, that isn't the only kind of data they get from you, right? They also get data about you when you are moving across the internet. So in another one of those reports, they also list all the different data partners that Facebook has. And these are partners that are either getting data from Facebook or Facebook is getting data from them. And so these are companies you probably haven't heard of, or you definitely haven't heard of all of them. Maybe you've heard of a couple of them, but they're out there and they're trying to grab data about you, and they're trying to make it so that that data can be put together with all those other forms of data, including the 17 billion location tagged posts. But this list goes on and on and on. And so there's another company focused on helping you get more privacy when you browse the internet. And they put together another report that puts it in a simple way that nearly 80% of websites on the internet have trackers, right? And so those are third-party trackers that website is going to give information about you. 15% of websites they contain 10 or more trackers, right? So that means 10 or more third-party companies that they're sharing data about your web activities with. 60% of page loads contain scripts from just Google, and 27 contain scripts from just Facebook. So 60% of your normal day-to-day traffic is known by Google. And with a little bit of graph theory, right, you know that they also get information about when you're browsing the internet, it's pretty easy to understand where somebody comes into your web page and where they go to out of your web page. So just because Google has 60% of pages with their script on, they know actually a lot more of your browsing activity to pages that aren't included in that 60%. So just a huge amount of data about how you're living in your digital lives is going to these organizations. And we're all okay with that. We're all primarily, or fundamentally, we're all just like putting up with it. So the way that we're putting up with it with our browsing activity is the same way that we put up with it with our location data. This same period of centralization is the period that our relationship with personal location data was born. I can point to three important actors in shaping our understanding of location data today, and they only date back to 2000. So in May of 2000, they flipped the switch that allowed civilians to get access to high-resolution GPS data. So at 4 a.m. in the middle of the night, your ability to take a GPS device and get your location went from the resolution of a football field to the resolution of your kitchen counter. Okay? So that alone is very exciting for technology. It lets us build most everything that you work on today. But combined with two other things. One is the release of the predominance of smartphones today. With every single smartphone having one of those high-resolution GPS chips in it. And ubiquitous real-time mapping. So we're all giving location data so that we can create these maps all the time. And these three things, I think, have really defined our way of understanding our own location data. And it hasn't been in this, it isn't the same way that we thought about the origins of the internet. There was no decentralization here. And another way to understand why that's important for geospatial data is geospatial data lacks those foundational protocols. So you can ask yourself, in a centralized system, typically what you think of as APIs. In a decentralized system, the typical thing you think of is protocols. And so in the geospatial world, ask yourselves, is it a protocol or is it an API? And these are foundational units of everything we work on. Points of interest, API or protocol. It's only APIs you get these things from. Streets and street traffic. APIs or protocols? It's APIs. And so geospatial data has only lived in this centralized world. We have organizations that collect each of these types of data and then try to sell it to us or try to exchange it to us for something we're using for. But this data is us. This data is actually you and I moving around. It's the same as the browsing data on the internet. This is data that's coming from our phones. I love the ones of like Burning Man. It's wild that they get that high resolution of all the people in the desert because it seems fundamentally at a disconnect with what the people are in the desert to do, right? I don't think many people would actually be out there realizing that they're helping draw this digital map with their personal data. So let me ask you a few other questions to help frame this idea of location data being centralized and not owned by us anymore. So how many of you have been reminded of your parking spot on Google? So you go and you drive someplace and you park and then you walk away. And when you're walking around, do you ever get reminded of the parking space? Anybody? Okay, so how many of you have every run you've taken in the last year in Strava? How many of you put your runs in Strava or your bike rides in Strava? How many of you have a copy of that original data? How many of you have like a database? Any of you have little postages you put your runs into? We have one? Okay, how many of you have a copy of every store you've walked into in the last year? But the crazy thing is that there's dozens of companies in the world that are trying to collect that exact data about you all the time, right? And they're trying to collect that data and they're putting it into the centralized databases, and you don't control it. And they put significant energy into this, and I think actually there's probably people in the room that work for those companies trying to put significant energy into collecting and aggregating this data. And it may not alone be a bad thing that we're trying to collect and aggregate the data, but it's definitely shaped our understanding and our perception of geospatial data, right? So we're used to it living in a centralized system and being out of our control. So we just give it away and we forget about it. So I asked some researchers to go out on the street and help me draw this very scientific graph. But I think it's another really interesting way to think about this because from those moments, from those early moments in our thinking of digital location data, so the moment that GPS data became high resolution for each of us, the moment that we all put a smartphone in our pocket, and the moment that mapping data became a really important value driver for businesses, since that moment onward, so many more aspects of our digital lives have become available, but our control over that data hasn't changed a bit, right? So from 2006 to now, think about how many different dimensions of yourself live in digital data. So it's gone from things like your chats on AOL Messenger or GChat later, and maybe some emails, to now it has your dating profiles, it has the places you're driving, it has the way you're shopping, it has your grocery lists. And so many different dimensions of ourselves are becoming digital, but nothing's changing about how much control you have over it or how much choice you have with what's done with that data. So I said it may not be a problem that data lives in a centralized world and personal data lives in a centralized world, but I do want to address what potential problems there are with it. And I think I have 5 problem areas. The first really obvious one is by putting so much personal data into centralized systems, it leads to these single points of failure. And I'd be surprised if there's anybody in the room that hasn't been affected by these single points of failure, whether you know it or not. So one high-profile one from a few years ago was the Ashley Madison hack, right? But at the time in 2015, when the Ashley Madison hack, it got a lot of news, right? Because it was outing people that were cheating on their significant others, and then their names were just exposed on the internet. And so that was a big story. But at the time, it pretty much didn't rank as far as like big hacks that had already happened to these centralized stores of personal data. Okay, so that was 2015. Another really big one that made the news was the Equifax hack. But you can see already when this one happened, there were already 2 Yahoo ones that were just like dwarfing it, just huge. So huge amounts of data are being lost from these centralized failures. And so like I said, all of you have probably been affected by at least one of these hacks. This Have I Been Pawned website, you can go and throw any of your personal emails into, and they'll tell you which of these hacks your data has been part of. But over 5 billion accounts have been aggregated in this site. I definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't. It'll at least give you an idea of which accounts you should be starting to change passwords if you share passwords across many of your old emails and things like that. Decentralized systems aren't immune to the points of failure. Another high-profile high-profile failure that we all probably remember is the Heartbleed. So Heartbleed was in a decentralized technology. So we're not totally immune from these if we build decentralized systems, but it's quite different. So the second through the fourth, I'm kind of grouping together here because I want to come back to that graph that I showed at the very beginning from Chris Dixon's blog post. So unknown motives, censorship, and abuse of power in centralized systems. So this all comes down to having very few people in charge of what's happening with your data. So Chris Dixon makes this point that, and this is related to the network effects, the 2 forms of network effects. At the beginning of centralized systems, the primary motivation is to get more users. So you can drive more value through your organization by adding more and more users. At some point, you realize that there's a cap to how many more users you can add. How many more users can Facebook really add? So there's not more value that they can get from going in and attracting more users, but they need to keep growing in value. And so what they do is they flip it, and they start extracting value from us, the users, right? And so that's when they start extracting intelligence that they can create from our data. They start selling advertising from that data. And so he calls this the bait and switch. So we're all attracted to these platforms when they're actually just trying to serve us and get us to be part of them, and then they flip it and they make us the commodity. And the impacts of that are similar to the points of failure, but if you look at Cambridge Analytica, it wasn't really a point of failure. It was actually somebody using the API that was developed in order to extract data about us. And so that was, for me, this is a very clear indicator of the bait and switch having already happened at that point. I am really curious when the geospatial world is going to have their own Cambridge Analytica. I think that we sort of skirt that the issues because people are so much less familiar with it. When you say that Cambridge Analytica harvested all this data about your Facebook use, it feels much more familiar to most people what that really means. But when there are hacks of location data, I don't think people quite understand how intimate that can actually be and how much that tells organizations about us. There's one that's been unfolding in the last week that I think is really interesting, though. I don't know if you've been following this, but the New York Times broke this story that that a service that was meant to monitor where inmates were moving around by tracking their cell phones could actually be used for tracking any civilian. That story snowballed here, and we saw the second story being that confirming, yeah, it's true. Actually, there's companies that are aggregating all your location data from all the major cell providers and then selling that. And so you're not really even choosing to be part of that. You just use your cell phone and your location data is being sent. Then there was this blog post, and it said actually basically you could go to this one provider of location data, and you could put any cell phone you wanted and find that cell phone's location. And they showed that you could do it if it wasn't even your cell phone. So you could put your spouse's cell phone in there and find out where they were. Okay, and it got worse. So then there was another story, and it said actually that one provider got hacked, and all our data has been lost. Well, so it was like this hack was like 2,000 different sign-ins from different police around the world. So different accounts to this one provider had been hacked, and they had the sign-ins for those accounts, so they could basically do anything that those people could do. So all our location data has been compromised. It's really wild. So the fifth problem with centralized organizations is monopolies. And this one is something that I think we're starting to see with, particularly around our personal data more and more now. But monopolies in technology is something that we sort of have a relationship or an understanding of that comes and goes. But I think something that's so interesting right now is that there's such a fundamental difference between the size of Facebook versus the size of any competitor to Facebook. And I know I talk about Facebook a lot here, but they're just such a good pinata. But if you've looked at on Facebook, they have a VPN that they provide users, and they use that for actually intelligence about everything that those users are doing. And so there's some reports talking about how they use that to understand how successful features in Snapchat are before Snapchat has reported any numbers around them. And that's how they can do things like copy the stories feature and make it available and basically knock Snapchat's advantage away. And so that's really troublesome, right? Because then even a technology that is already on the public market, like Snapchat, that is pretty large, can't compete with somebody like Facebook. Okay, so what do we do? So centralization has all these vulnerabilities and could be a lot of problems. What are the solutions? And so one solution is to think more about how we can build decentralized things. And that pendulum is already swinging the other way. Chris Dixon says crypto networks use multiple mechanisms to ensure that they stay neutral as they grow, preventing that bait and switch. So they can basically attract users, but they can never flip on the user and make the user the product. And so we've seen some very successful technologies that are built this way, right? So the ones that you're probably already very familiar with are like Bitcoin. There's no mechanism within Bitcoin that can basically allow it to turn on you. Some other familiar ones are like CryptoKitties, right? CryptoKitties has no way to basically become anything other than CryptoKitties. But those are the ones you're familiar with, but there's actually a really big landscape now of decentralized technologies. And I think the reason why we're still not using them so much in our day-to-day is because so many of them are still building the foundational units of technology that we need. And so if you look at these, there are things like compute and file storage. There's communication, some messaging. There's one marketplace for actually sales of goods. But we're starting to layer on, now that we have some of these early units of decentralization, we're starting to layer on consumer technologies that we could start using instead of centralized technologies where your data can be aggregated and sold and who knows what. So that's what we're working on at Textile. And so I want to talk a second about what we're up to. So our first product, you can check it out. It's just textile.photos. But our vision is to build how many of you have a digital wallet? Any digital wallet holders? OK, a few of you, cool. So we think that if you're familiar with digital wallets, they give you a mechanism to control digital currencies through encryption. Okay? So when you have a digital wallet and you own some token on some of some kind, so Bitcoin or Ethereum or other, you hold the keys in your wallet so that you're the only person that can transact those tokens. We think that's the exact same way that your personal data should be. So those questions that I asked before about how many of you owned data about all the businesses you've gone into or all the runs you've taken, we think that that's the way that you should be keeping it. You should have encrypted copies of every piece of data you ever create. I wrote a blog post about how we're building that technology. You can just find it at bit.ly/textile01. And so this first product, we realized that most people don't think about personal data. And so that's what I've been showing you so far, is that all these hacks happen. All of us have been compromised many times, but still we're allowing our data to go out there and be compromised again. And so we thought, OK, if we're going to get people to actually own their own data, we need to give them a value that makes them not have to think about that's why they're doing it. So that's why we went to photos. Most people understand ideas of privacy, ownership, security in their photos. And so Textile Photos is actually a tool for us to help you populate a personal wallet with your own encrypted data. And so what happens is every photo that you take becomes encrypted and then stored on a decentralized storage system. So you can think of it like iCloud, but nobody could ever take it away from you. So if our company went away tomorrow, you'd actually still have that file encrypted and stored on a decentralized server someplace. The same thing, we give you ways for exchanging your data with other services. So if you want to put your photo into another service, you can do it. The first service that we have built on top of the wallet is peer-to-peer sharing. And so like I like to think of it like subreddits meets Instagram. So you can create these private communities to share your photos where only the other people in your community can see the photo you share. Again, it's encrypted and decentralized. So if our company goes away tomorrow, that can still live. So every photo that you share, all the communication that you do, lives on without us. And I think that this can lead us to actually storing more types of our personal data. I say soon, but don't quote me on how soon that will be. We have a lot of work to do. But I imagine a future where we all own every piece of digital data we create. And so I say photos, I think location soon. But I think of a future where we have even every key we ever strike on a keyboard, and all your health records. Everything is in a place where you own it. It's encrypted. It's secure. With location data, it gets really exciting if you imagine owning your data and then authorizing other people to use it. Because right now, the way that organizations get your location data is they try to scrape as much of it as possible without you really thinking about how much they're scraping. So it's always these very incomplete profiles of location data. But in a future where you feel comfortable about collecting every single coordinate that you can ever create, you can then authorize people that you trust to use it and algorithms that you trust to use it to create much better products. So you can put your location data to work in ways that isn't possible today. And so with that, I want to kind of leave you with a final thought. Albert Wenger here in New York, he said decentralized with a purpose. And so I started thinking, OK, so how would decentralization work in geospatial systems? If we're right and we can get people to own their geospatial data, what next? So I want to go back to that idea of protocols versus APIs. And So if you want to start thinking about this and what the future looks like if this movement towards decentralization is true and how it might affect your organizations, start thinking about some of these foundational units of the geospatial stack being reinvented as decentralized protocols. So point of interest validation, real-time street traffic, business location and hours. Imagine having no central authority, but people actually coming up with mechanisms to create those in real time from real data. And so that's like, those are the foundations of geospatial sciences. But then we can go layers above that. So you can imagine right now the reason why telcos have access to your location data pretty much unrestricted is so things like 911 services can work, which to me seems like a pretty ugly hack. But we could imagine in a decentralized system where you own your data, you could authorize people to get access to it when you need to call 911 or 911 needs to find you. And so we can imagine reinventing those. And then, of course, there's social and business layers that come on top of that. And so for all of you working on these things, I think it's going to really demand you to rethink the way these things will work and how you want to build organizations around them. Because I don't think that this is actually so far off. And I know that there's a lot of companies already starting to work and think through how geospatial data is going to emerge in these systems. So with that, I want to say thanks and take any questions.